Hello, planet Earth, and thanks for coming back to Master English with Tim, the podcast where I help you learn English in depth and detail and without ever hurrying. In last week's B1 and B2 level episode, I taught you about the active voice and the passive voice, the construction of each voice, the meaning of each voice, and the situations where we use each voice. Even though I talked about both the active and the passive voices last week, the real star of the episode was the passive voice, and I taught everything you need to get a solid start in understanding the passive voice. However, I couldn't say everything about the passive voice in just one episode. And so in this week's B2 and C1 episode, I am going to continue and complete my discussion of the passive voice by teaching you about 6 different details of the passive voice that most people don't notice, or that are more typical of advanced and even academic English. To understand these 6 points well, you do need to already have a solid understanding of the passive voice. So if you have not already listened to episode 119 from last week, I strongly recommend that you do that before listening to this week's episode. Also, this week's episode contains a lot of detailed information, so I strongly suggest that you break the episode up. Maybe listen to half one day and half another, or 2 points from the episode today, or whatever is best for you. So, let's get started. The first thing that we need to talk about in talking about the passive voice is a specific limitation on how we use the passive voice. This limitation is connected with verbs that are used with prepositions. Prepositions are words like at, from, in, of, on, and with. So I just told you 6 examples of prepositions, and I chose specifically those 6 out of the more than 100 prepositions that we have in the English language because those 6 are the prepositions that we use most often after verbs. So here are some examples of common verbs that we use with prepositions after them. Look after, laugh at, look at, pay for, borrow from, escape from, hear from, hide from, protect from, save from, believe in, accuse of, dream of, remind of, base on, rely on, spend on, work on, listen to, object to, refer to, and deal with. So, what is the connection between verbs with prepositions and the passive voice? Well, in a lot of grammar books, you can find a rule that says you should not use verbs with prepositions in the passive voice. But is that true? Well, in order to answer that question, let's take one very big step back from that very specific question and instead look at, for a minute or two different ways of thinking and talking about grammar in general. Not just the passive voice, but how to look at and think about grammar in general. So one of 2 ways to think about grammar is the more traditional way, and it is called the prescriptive view of grammar. According to the prescriptive view, there are correct ways to make words, phrases, and sentences, and there are incorrect ways to make words, phrases, and sentences. And so, of course, the correct ways are considered good, and the incorrect ways are considered bad. Now, the other way, the second way of looking at and thinking about grammar, is the descriptive view of grammar. The descriptive view, like its name suggests, tries to describe how people in fact use grammar. The descriptive view will sometimes say that this or that construction is used often or is standard, or that another construction is rarely used and is not standard. So, which view is correct? Well, my view is much closer to the descriptive view. If everyone constructs a word, phrase, or sentence in a particular way, then I tend to think that's okay. I think that's okay because my goal is to help you understand how people really use English so you can use English in a similar way yourself. So, now we can come back to our earlier question. Is it really a mistake to use a verb with a preposition in the passive voice? Well, my answer is that it's simply a fact that some verbs with prepositions are often used in the passive voice, while other verbs of this type are less often found in passive voice sentences, or really never. And if someone chooses to use one of these other verbs in the passive voice, one that's not often used or that is never used in the passive voice, it will sound weird. And in reality, that's kind of a mistake. So in the descriptive view, actually, when you say that something is not used or is very rarely used, it comes close to saying that that is a mistake, but it's not quite the same thing because it is more flexible and it does allow the language to change, and descriptive grammar tries to reflect what actually happens in the language instead of trying to freeze everything in a particular moment and say, no, this is how things are and should be and should always be in the future. So if something sounds right, well, it's probably used all the time. So in my opinion, the best thing to do in this particular case is just to focus on the verbs with prepositions that do sound normal in the passive voice, the ones that in fact get used in the passive voice. So let me now tell you the verbs with prepositions that do sound okay in the passive voice. And after each of these verbs, I will give you an example sentence including the verb. 17 verbs and 17 examples. 1. Look after. Don't worry, your mother is being looked after by the city's best doctors. 2. Laugh at. I can't believe I was laughed at by everyone because of such a small mistake. 3. Look at. So this is look at in the sense of inspect. Try to find a problem in something. So our documents say that your car was looked at by Jonathan. 4. Don't worry, everything has been paid for. 5. Borrow from. Over 1,000 books were borrowed from the library last month. 6. Escape from. Alcatraz is the name of a famous American prison that never once was escaped from. 7. Hear from. Amelia Earhart was a famous U.S. pilot. In 1937, she and her navigator disappeared while trying to fly across the Pacific Ocean, and they were never heard from again. 8. Hide from. I have the feeling that important information is being hidden from us. 9. Protect from. People who have received the vaccine are protected from the virus. 10. Save from. Luckily, the most important documents were saved from the fire, and no one was in the office when the fire started. 11. Accuse of. He was accused of murder. 12. Remind of. As I walked past my childhood home, I was reminded of the long afternoons we spent playing outside there. 13. Base on. Your profit estimates are based on statistics that I think are too optimistic. 14. Rely on. The state's free medical services are relied on by millions of poor people. 15. Spend on. Over $10 million have been spent on the project to build a new bridge. 16. Listen to. This radio station is listened to by thousands of people every day. 17th and last. Deal with. Don't worry, your problem will be dealt with soon. Okay, let's now move on to our second important point about the passive voice. Our second point is about verbs that we use with indirect objects. If you don't know what an indirect object is, I strongly suggest that you listen to episode 119 from last week. So, some languages other than English do not use the passive voice with verbs and indirect objects, but in English, this construction is possible. If you think about it, this is pretty strange because normally the logic of the passive voice is that a direct object of a sentence is used instead as a subject of a sentence. So in other words, a direct object turns into a subject. But coming back to the idea of descriptive grammar, it simply is a fact that in English, verbs with indirect objects are frequently used in the passive voice. A high school English teacher or college English professor would probably write a big blood red X on this type of construction if any of their students used it, but the reality is that people speak and write this way all the time. So listen now to 15 examples of verbs with indirect objects used in the passive voice. Number 1, deny. I was denied entry into the building. If you deny entry to someone, it means that you don't let them enter. So again, I was denied entry into the building. That means they didn't let me enter the building. 2, feed. The alpacas got sick because they were fed the wrong food. 3. Give. Why is Tom always given the most interesting assignments? 4. Grant. She was granted a pardon by the president. 5. Lend. When are you going to pay back the $10,000 you have been lent? 6. Lie. I have the feeling I have been lied to. 7. We've been told so many different things that we don't know what to believe anymore. 8. Offer. Elaine was offered a raise and promotion, but stayed in her old job. 9. Pay. We will go out of business if we aren't paid the millions of dollars we are owed by our partners. 10. Pay again. According to our records, we were paid in cash. 11. Promise. Jerry was promised an upgrade to a seat in business class. 12. Refuse. We were refused service at the hotel and don't know why. 13. Sell. After months of trying to repair the car, I understood I'd been sold a lemon. So lemon is conversational English language for a car or motorcycle, any vehicle, or could also be a computer that is in such bad condition that you cannot repair it. You put money into it and something else is wrong. Something else is wrong. Always something wrong. So again, the sentence is, after months of trying to repair the car, I understood I'd been sold a lemon. 14. Give and also serve. We were given VIP status and served before everyone else. 15th and last, teach. I was taught Spanish with the old grammar translation method. True story. And did it work? Yeah, it worked reasonably well. All right, that's everything I have to say about indirect objects in the passive voice. Let's move on to our third detail about the passive voice. So normally we form the passive with a form of the verb be, then the past participle of a verb. But we also have another option for how to form the passive voice. We can replace be with get. Listen now to 3 examples of the passive voice with get. 1. My computer got stolen last week. 2. Our biggest bridge got damaged in the storm. 3rd and last. I don't play cards because I get tricked so easily. Okay, so the examples that I chose are representative or typical of cases where we use get instead of be. You can use get in the passive voice whenever you want, but we generally choose get with verbs that talk about something negative. Maybe you picked up on that negative feeling from those 3 sentences. Also, when we use get in the passive voice, it gives the idea that the action happens unexpectedly or suddenly. Finally, we use get in the passive voice in more informal contexts. So to review, 3 things. The passive voice with get is usually about something negative, usually about something sudden or unexpected, and usually has an informal tone. So negative, sudden, and informal. So let's now do 17 examples. 1. Beat up. I got beaten up walking home on Friday. 2. Bite. Have you ever gotten bitten by a dog? 3. Burn. My finger got burned by the cigarette. 4. Buy. I'm sorry, but the watch you were interested in got bought by someone else. 5. Cancel. The concert got canceled because of rain. 6. Damage. Our roof got damaged during the storm. 7. Destroy. The bridge got destroyed by a bomb. 8. Eat. All of the plants in our garden got eaten by squirrels. 9. Fire. You'll get fired if you keep coming to work late. 10. Hit. Look both ways when you cross the street or you'll get hit by a car. 11. Hurt. Seth keeps getting hurt skateboarding, but that doesn't stop him. 12. Injure. He got injured while mountain skiing. 13. Kill. You can easily get killed flying a wingsuit. 14. Scratch. The paint on my new car already got scratched. 15. Sentence. The criminal got sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder. So if you sentence someone for something, it means that you give them a particular punishment, a particular length of time in prison. So sentence once more, the criminal got sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder. 16, shoot. Oh my God, how did you manage to get shot in the leg? Oh, I walked into a part of the forest where people hunt. 17th and last, steal. My bike got stolen last week. All right, let's now move on to our fourth interesting passive construction. This construction is one of two constructions which we call a past participial phrase. A past participial phrase is a shortened version of a passive voice phrase inside of a sentence. Normally, when we form the passive voice, we have a noun or pronoun, and then after that, we have a form of be or sometimes get, and then after that, we have a past participle. In these past participial phrases that we're going to work on, though, we eliminate the noun or pronoun and use just the past participle. We also remove the verb be or get, so it's just the past participle. So let's now listen to a shorter sentence that includes a past participial phrase, then a sentence with the full phrase that means exactly the same thing as the first shorter sentences, and then we'll look at the first one again. So the sentences are a bit long and pretty formal, so listen closely. The details are important here. In fact, the details are the only thing we're trying to learn right now. So, number one, many goods made outside of the U.S. are now subject to heavy taxes. So, two, longer version, means exactly the same thing. Many goods which are made outside of the U.S. are now subject to heavy taxes. Third and last, back to the original sentence with the short version. Many goods made outside of the U.S. are now subject to heavy taxes. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that in the longer sentence, we had the first noun, goods, and then the phrase, which are made outside of the U.S. So the complete phrase was, goods which are made outside of the U.S. Again, the complete phrase is, goods which are made outside of the U.S. Listen again to the shorter sentence and try to understand what we use to replace that long phrase. So, many goods made outside of the U.S. are now subject to heavy taxes. So the answer is, we had the long phrase, goods which are made outside of the U.S., and we removed from it the words which are. The resulting shorter phrase was goods made outside of the U.S. So again, we went from goods which are made outside of the U.S., and then we had goods made outside of the U.S. So this type of passive construction, where we have a noun and then a phrase that starts with the past participle, is most common in written English. So listen now to 5 more sentences which include this advanced passive construction. 1. Clothing and personal items left behind will be given to charity after 30 days. 2. Passengers affected by weather delays of more than 3 hours receive a full refund. 3. Books translated from another language into English sometimes have a strange style. 4. Paint manufactured before the 1990s often contained a lot of lead. Lead is a type of poisonous metal. It's gray and soft. So again, paint manufactured before the 1990s often contained a lot of lead. 5th and last, people born in the 1980s are the last people to know about life before the internet. Okay, let's now move on to our 5th passive voice construction. This construction is another past participial phrase. In this second type of past participial phrase, which is also typical of written, formal, and academic English, we start a sentence with the past participle that gives information about the subject of the sentence that comes after it. Listen to one example. Fascinated, he listened closely. So, the past participle fascinated, or deeply interested, refers to the subject of the sentence, which is he. Another, longer way of saying the same thing would be, he was fascinated, he listened closely. So usually, this type of passive construction, this type of participial phrase, includes more than just one word. Listen now to a slightly longer version of the example you just heard before. Completely fascinated by the speaker's ideas, he listened closely. Now listen to 6 more examples of sentences that start with past participial phrases. 1. Designed in Germany and built in Yugoslavia, Yugo brand cars were sold in the United States in the 1980s. 2. Confused by the teacher's instructions, most of the children received bad grades on their tests. 3. Largely forgotten by the year 1700 before Christ, the Sumerian language continued to be used in religious contexts until 100 years after Jesus' birth. 4. Infected by multiple viruses, the computer soon completely stopped functioning. 5. Read by hundreds of millions of people all over the world, Stephen King will soon publish his next book. 6th and last. Badly sunburnt and dehydrated, the desert travelers were lucky to survive their trip. Okay, we have one final detail about the passive voice. This detail has to do with just one specific verb, and in fact, just one specific meaning of that verb. The verb is make, and the meaning is force someone to do something. So the verb make has several different meanings. One of them is to force someone to do something. So what is special about make with the meaning of force someone to do something in the passive voice? Well, when we use make in this meaning in the passive voice, we need to add the very small word to, to, before the next verb. Here's a very simple example. I was made to stay in the office until 2 in the morning. So again, I was made to stay in the office. Not I was made stay, but I was made to stay in the office until 2 in the morning. So again, make in this meaning is the only verb in English that requires us to add the word to in the passive voice. 3 more examples of this same phenomenon. 1. When I was in the army and we had no useful work to do, we were sometimes made to paint the grass green. 2. After he was found guilty of drunk driving, he was made to clean garbage up from the highway for 8 hours a day for 2 weeks. 3rd and last, the prisoners were made to run in freezing temperatures wearing only shorts. Okay, that is all for the passive voice, and that is everything for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all next Monday.